We're coming to the end of our study on Romance of Redemption. We've been studying the life of Ruth and this beautiful love story that comes out of the time of the Judges. That's one of the things that makes it such a contrast is Judges was such a terrible time, and here right in the middle of it, God gives us this beautiful love story of redemption. This last lesson I'm going to call is Mistress Boaz. Mistress Boaz. It's a beautiful consummation of the whole story of redemption, and I hope you've enjoyed the story as much as I've enjoyed sharing it with you. In most weddings focus on the bride, and rightfully so. But this is a wedding that focuses on Boaz, the groom. The focus is on him, and I don't want to disappoint anybody, but when we go to the marriage supper of the Lamb, people are not going to be looking at us as much as they're going to be looking at Jesus. That's where the focus is going to be. It's going to be on Jesus Christ. In this story, for instance, you find the name of Boaz 8 times, and yet Ruth's name is only mentioned 3 times. 2.5 times more, you find Boaz is mentioned. As I said, he's the center of attention. And rightfully so, because he's the one that makes all of this possible. If it had not been for him, we wouldn't even have the story. Now, in the Bible, when you're talking about the law of the close relative, the law of the kinsman redeemer, someone redeeming someone, in Deuteronomy, the 25th chapter, in verse 9, it talks about the closer redeemer or the closer kinsman that says, I don't want to redeem. And if he doesn't, then the bride could do some humiliating things for him. There's no humiliation in this story, even though this closer redeemer says, no, I don't want to be a kinsman redeemer. There's none here. But when you look at the story of Jesus, it was a double injustice that was done to Christ. Because Christ did redeem us. He didn't reject us. He didn't refuse us. He did redeem us. And yet, they still humiliated him. Back to the book of Deuteronomy, the 25th chapter, it's saying that the potential bride, this widow that wants to be redeemed, and the man said, no, I don't want to do it. She could spit in his face. Do you realize 6 times tells they spit on Jesus. They spit in his face. I give you the reference here in Matthew 26:67, Matthew 27:30, and Mark 10:34, Mark 14:65, Mark 15:19, and then Luke 18:32. And so it's a double injustice because he was redeeming us while they were humiliating him. Now let me break this down into 4 basic parts I want to talk about. First, Elimelech's farm. It was a custom in Israel when someone was purchasing a new piece of property, and this during that time, this history, that what would happen is the new owner of that property would put on the shoes of the previous owner and walk all the way around that property. That was a way of declaring, I have purchased this land. It now belongs to me. And that's what happens here. You find Boaz takes the shoes of the previous owner, or probably in this case would be the kinsman, that had the right to redeem but refused to do it. He put on his sandals and he walks around that property, testifying, I am the new owner of this property. And now nobody has a right to walk on this property unless I give them permission. So he is the owner. Now, when you understand this custom, it helps you understand what John the Baptist was talking about in Mark, the 1st chapter, and verse 7, where John said, I do not have the right or the authority to loose his sandals, talking about Jesus Christ. He's referring to the same thing. He's saying, Jesus is greater than I am. Jesus is the one that owns the farm, not me. I don't have the right to loose his sandals. So this was a cultural custom that they did, part of the way that they signified new ownership. Now again, going back to the story of redemption, talking about Jesus, do you realize that's what the Roman soldiers did? They took away his sandals even when he was redeeming us. How do we know they took them away? Because the Bible said they pierced his hands and his feet. So even when he's redeeming us, they're still humiliating him. What an injustice. It cost Christ his very life to redeem us. Now, the third thing I want to talk about, the second thing I want to talk about is Boaz's wife. Boaz's wife, who of course is Ruth. He didn't marry Naomi, he married Ruth. Boaz not only purchases the farm, but he purchases Ruth to be his bride, to be his wife. And in a marriage covenant, it's not just between two people. In this case, for instance, the emphasis is on a threefold commitment here, a threefold oath of commitment. It's between God, between the couple, and between the community or the family. Here's the way that it's written. I have acquired to be my wife. That's personal. That's between the people. And then he says, the people answered and says, we are witnesses of this. And so now we're talking about the community. And then finally, he says, the Lord make you like the house of Judah. And they pronounce a blessing. So it's threefold. It's not just between people and between family, but it's also with God. Marriage is this way. It's a commitment to each other, to society, and to God. It's much more than just two people being joined together. It's two families that are being joined together. And it's why I want to emphasize this. I think it's very important. If at all possible, obtain the blessings of the family before you marry your spouse. If you can, get her blessing, the blessing not only her, but her family. She should get the blessing of your family, if at all possible. And I understand sometimes it's not possible. But if at all possible, do it, because you're going to have to live life together. And family is covenant. So you should seek out the blessings of her parents, his parents. Do as much as you possibly can. It's a blessing that's going to mean much to you. Or I say it this way, it's not right to ask her to marry you and divorce her parents. It's going to be a problem for you in the future. So don't do it. So we find that Boaz and Ruth, they not only were committed to each other, but they also have the blessing of the community. There is nothing that's more beautiful than a beautiful wedding. When a couple have done it right, and I mean, they stand before the altar of God in what we call holy matrimony, and they're committing themselves to each other. It's a beautiful thing to see the blessing of not just the families, but the church, the community that is upon them. And so they said to her, may God bless you and prosper you in Ephratah. Now that word, we saw it back in the opening verses of the book of Ruth. It was talking about the place of fruitfulness in Ephratah, and be famous in Bethlehem. Do you see what's happened? This story opens up with a famine in Bethlehem. It ends up with a blessing in Bethlehem. And I encourage you, in your walk, I know we cannot go back and undo the past. There's some things in our past all of us would change if we could do that. You can't go back and change that. But you can do it right from this day forward. Purpose in your heart. You're going to do life the correct way, the right way. And I assured you, it will get better. There's a good verse of scripture in the book of Ecclesiastes where he's talking about the conclusion of how to live a successful life. And one of those is, remember now your Creator in the days of your youth. But he says, one of the things that you need to do is cast your bread upon the waters, because after many days it will come back to you. And he was talking about their way of sowing the seed and planting and such, and he's talking about a good harvest. But someone as well said, he said, cast your bread upon the waters and it'll come back. What he didn't say, but is true, if you do it right, if you do it with God's blessings, your bread will come back with butter and jam on it. That's a good way of saying it, because God will bless you. And I can testify that in my life. Oh my. And it's not just my life, but I've watched the lives of so many others. Those that live for God, it gets better. Those that don't live for God, the problems get worse. Oh, how I thank God. I purposed when I was just a young man, I was going to give my life to God and serve Him with all of my heart, because these are the best days of my life. This is the way it ought to be. Again, I've got to conclude this thought, but one other verse of scripture. In the book of Ecclesiastes, he said, the end of a thing is better than its beginning, if you do it right. If you do it wrong, it will not work that way. It won't be better. It can be a lot worse. But if you do it right, you'll be blessed. It'll be better than the beginning. And so when you look at this 4th chapter, it talks about Ruth again. And for the first time in the story, Ruth is not called a Moabite. Now, back in chapter 3, she made this statement of herself, but that was a statement of faith, because technically she still was a Moabite. She simply said, I am Ruth, your servant. But that was a statement of faith, because she was still a Moabite. But now, after the wedding, she's never called the Moabitess again. No, no, no. She is now just Ruth. She is the follower of God. She becomes a part of the Israelite family. And when you go to the New Testament, you find Ruth is a part of the genealogy of Jesus Christ. What a story of grace. Now, let me talk about a third part of this story that it really begins to get interesting. Naomi's baby. Yes, you heard me correctly. I didn't say Ruth's baby. I said Naomi's baby. Now we know, yes, it was Ruth that gave birth to this baby boy. It was Ruth and and Boaz who had the baby named Obed. But that's not the way the story records it. The story records it, the women came in and they saw Naomi and with this baby, and they called it Naomi's baby. Wow, what a statement. See, when Boaz takes Ruth to be his wife, the Bible said the Lord gave her conception and she bore a son. But the ladies don't say Ruth's baby. The ladies say, a baby is born to Naomi. And they were right. They were exactly right. Because what had been lost has been restored. Under the law of Moses, with the kinsman redeemer, when a man's relative died and he married the widow of the deceased man, the firstborn child was not considered his child. It was considered the child of the deceased man. So technically what they are saying is accurate. Naomi has got a new baby. He takes the place of the two sons that have died. Now, we understand, and we're talking about life here. You cannot go back and replace the boys, but we're talking about life goes on. Life continues. So there's a new baby that's born into this family, and they're calling it Naomi's baby. The name that they give to this baby is Obed. Obed. That is interesting, because the name Obed means a servant worshiper. That's what it means. A servant worshiper. Now that's of significance. Don't think that lightly, because when you think about serving God, or you think about being a worshiper of God, both of those have to be birthed in our hearts through our relationship with Jesus Christ. It's not a mechanical thing. It's not just something that we do as a dead ritual. No, our service to God, we're to serve him from our heart, with our whole heart. How are we to worship God? From our heart, with a whole heart. So when Obed is born as a servant worshiper, it speaks about what ought to be born in our lives the same way. It's interesting, the baby, when he grows up and becomes a man, guess what? Obed becomes the grandfather of great King David. Now that's something that Ruth could not have understood. It's something that Naomi could not have understood. What grace was going to restore in their lives that they had. Everything that had been lost has been restored to them again. And so King David, Obed, is his grandfather. Obed is the father of Jesse. Jesse is the father of David. What a tremendous story, a story of God's grace. Now, the fourth thing I want to talk about in conclusion is what I'm going to call God's romance. That's what this whole story is about. That's why I call it the romance of redemption. I think it's the best title I've ever heard for the book of Ruth. The romance of redemption. The whole Bible is found here. The whole Bible. God's a genius. Only God can take and write the whole Bible in 4 short chapters. But that's what he does. Here's the way that the story is outlined. The story begins in death, in a famine. It ends in life with a new baby. Boy, that's exactly what happens for those that come to Jesus Christ. We were dead in trespasses and sins, but he gives us new life. He gives us hope. He gives us future. The story starts with a backslider. It ends with a great. Boy, that's the way it was for us too. We were all sinners. All of us have sinned, and yet that's not the end of the story. Where's the end of the story going to end? We're going to be with the great King, Jesus Christ. That's the end of the story. See, this is the story of two different covenants. Two different covenants. And that's what we have in our Bible. The first covenant is finished. It's over. So a new covenant can be established. This is one of the things that gave the Israelites so much problems with prophets like Jeremiah. Jeremiah, I mean, they become so angry with him, they wanted to kill him. They tried to do it several times, but God preserved his life. But Jeremiah, he would say, you say, the temple, the temple, the temple. This temple will be destroyed. Boy, they would get so angry about that. And then he would talk about the covenant of God, the covenant of Moses. The first covenant, he said, will be destroyed, that God will establish a second covenant. And the writer of the book of Hebrews picks up on that. And he says that's what we have with Jesus Christ, is a new covenant with God. See, the first covenant was broken because of unbelief. It's amazing when you study the history of the Jews. They could act as ungodly as anybody. They broke the laws of God. In fact, when God gave Moses the 10 Commandments, guess what? The Israelites have already broken them before Moses can present them to him. Moses comes down the mountain and sees them in idolatry. They've already broken them, and so he takes them and dashes them in pieces at his feet because they broke it before they even received it. Wow, that's the Israelites. And that's why he says in the book of Hebrews, the 8th chapter and verse 13, how powerful. He's actually quoting from the book of Jeremiah. The first covenant is abolished. It's finished. It's obsolete and growing old. What's he talking about growing old? Well, there's a picture of it in the book of Ruth. Elimelech is growing old in the ground. He's growing old in a graveyard. His flesh, dust is returning to dust. And that's what he's saying. This old covenant, it's obsolete. It's growing old. It's ready to vanish away. Why? So we can receive a new covenant. A new covenant that he says is established on better promises. A better covenant. This is the covenant of faith. The covenant of grace that comes through Jesus Christ. Thank God Jesus is a Jew, but you and I were not Jews. But he has made us a part of his family. And the curse is now gone. We are no longer Gentiles. We are a part of a new race of people that Jesus is the head of that race. Remember in the book of Corinthians where Paul talked about the first and the last Adam? The first and the last Adam. What's he mean? He means Adam was the head of the human race. Jesus is the head of a new race of people, the born-again people, the people that are born of God. We are part of that covenant relationships. And so that's what the Bible is all about. It's the story of two covenants. Two covenants. And that's what you find here. You find Elimelech and Naomi, they represent Israel and the law of Moses. Boaz and Ruth, they represent Christ and his church and a new covenant, a covenant of love. Now for us, this is new revelation. For some of you, some of these things that I'm sharing are new thoughts and new insights. But for God, this was God's plan from the beginning, before the foundation of the world. See, Christ wasn't just slain at Golgotha, a hill in Calvary. The Bible said Jesus was slain in the mind of God, the plan of God, before the foundation of the world. That was God's plan to redeem us, to make us a part of his family. So we're not just people, we are the people of God. And we're a part of this new race, this new Adam, Jesus Christ. We're a part of his family. So the first covenant was destined to fail, so that a new covenant could be established and we could have an eternal relationship with God. My. Oh, the wisdom of God to be able to devise such a plan. Only God could do that. Just like Ruth, God has destined you and I as Gentiles to become the part of a wedding, of a Jewish bridegroom, so that we can have a relationship with God. It's the only way possible that we could be holy. See, every baby is born into this world born innocent, but there's a difference between being innocent and being holy, because the baby's not only innocent, the baby is also ignorant. But for you and I, God calls us a holy people, a royal priesthood. Do you understand what has happened to us? We're not just innocent. No, he has made us holy. Our holiness is our relationship with Jesus Christ. And so you find this in the book of Revelation, the 19th chapter, where he talks about the believer being clothed in the righteousness of Christ, clothed in wedding garments, because we are going to the marriage supper of the Lamb. Now let me bring this to a close and conclusion by talking about this. Something very interesting here. You find in the book of John, the first chapter, verse 11 and 12, where Jesus came to his own, Israelites, Jews. But the Bible said, his own received him not. They closed the door. But it goes on to say, but to everyone that received him, to them he gave the right to be the sons of God, the children of God. It was a revolving door. When the Jews closed their door, it opened the door for the Gentiles, everyone that believes. And that's what this new covenant is based on. The old covenant and where it failed, it was our weakness. It was based on our behavior. Do this, don't do that. But the new covenant is based on Jesus Christ. And as he hangs on the cross, he cries, "It is finished." Paid the price for our redemption. What is our part? Our part is to believe on what he has done. When we put our faith in him, when we believe in Jesus, that's what it means to be redeemed, to be purchased of God, to become a son or a daughter of God. But there's something else I want to point out here. God has not forgotten Israel, just like in this story with Ruth. They called this new baby Naomi's baby. And technically they were right, because according to the law, the first child goes back to the ancestry of the dead man, the deceased. So this is why Paul, writing in the book of Romans, talks about the Jews and the Gentiles and our relationship with Christ. And he said, their rejection, talking about the Jews, rejecting Christ, became the reconciling of the world. What's he talking about? He's talking about that revolving door. When they closed the door, rejecting Christ, it opened the door for everyone that would believe upon Jesus. So he said, their rejecting of Christ became the reconciling of the Gentiles. Then he goes on to say, what will their redemption be? What is going to be their acceptance of Christ? But resurrection from the dead. Now, I don't know all that means, but it's telling us there's some way at the end of this story that God's going to tie it all back together again. What we call in English, tying up the loose ends, pulling it all back together again. That God's going to bring, oh yes, natural Israel, many of them still are unbelievers. There's many of them that are becoming covenant believers and followers of Jesus, but they as a nation have not received him yet. But the Bible tells us one day they're going to look upon him whom they pierced. They're going to look on the one that they rejected, and they're going to receive him and understand they missed the opportunity of their Savior. But God took it and turned it for good. He made good about it. And so this is what this story is. And so you find Naomi even at the end of the story, and it's saying of her, a baby is born to Naomi. My, the wisdom of God. No wonder he makes all things work together for good to them that love him. He's done all things well. That's what the Bible is. The Bible is the story of the romance of redemption. It's the story of God so loving people that he was not willing to let them die in their sin. He found a way to redeem them. And this is where a lot of people get confused with the Bible. They think it's about God. No. It's not the story of God. It tells us a lot about God. It's not the story of heaven or hell, eternity past or eternity future. We still have a lot of questions. And I have people asking me, where do demons come from? I'm not sure. I just know they're here. And because the Bible doesn't give us a clear definition. Learn to speak where the Bible speaks and be silent where it's silent. But what I know, the story that is told over and over and over again in the Bible is the story of redemption. God so loved the world. And he tells it to us in 1,000 different ways so that nobody will miss it. Nobody should miss the story. He makes it so clear. It's the story about a God that loved people so much, he found a way to redeem them. Even when they were far from him, he brought them into his family. So that's what it's all about, the story of the romance of redemption. And I pray that these lessons have clarified some things in your mind and helped you to understand just how much God loves you and just how bad you needed God. I needed God in our lives. And so may God bless you as you continue your journey of faith, following Jesus Christ in this beautiful romance of redemption.